Good morning and welcome to the Justice Committee's 13th and final meeting of 2016. We have apologies from Oliver Mundell. Agenda item number 1, decision on taking item in private. Items 6 and 7 are consideration of the committee's approach to the security of the Railway Policing Scotland Bill at stage 1 and consideration of its work programme. Is the committee content to take these items in private? Thank you. Agenda item 2, draft budget scrutiny 2017-18, and I welcome to the committee the Right Honourable James Wolfe, QC, Lord Advocate, and David Harvey, Crown Agent and Chief Executive of the Crown Office and Procurator Fiscal Service. This is the first time that both of you, or either of you, have appeared before the committee, and we very much look forward to working with you over this session. I refer members to paper 1, which is a note from the clerk, and paper 2, which is Spice briefing. The Crown Agent has also put in a written submission to the current Procurator Fiscal COPF Service Inquiry, which is partially relevant to this morning's session. I thank you for that. And I believe, Lord Advocate, you'd like to make a short opening statement.
Yes, thank you very much, Convener. May I thank you for inviting me to give evidence and also for permitting me to make some preliminary remarks, conscious as I am that this is my first appearance before your committee as Lord Advocate. I look forward very much to working with you during this session and my period of office. Can I say that your inquiry into the work of the prosecution service is, from my point of view, timely, and I'm looking forward to coming back, as I understand it, in January to discuss in more detail the evidence that you've received. I understand the purpose of the hearing today is budget scrutiny, and as you've indicated, Convener, I'm here with the Crown Agent, who is the Chief Executive and Accountable Officer of the service. I'd like to simply make a few observations to set the discussion about the budget in context. The first is this, that the media regularly report on high-profile prosecutions in which have been brought to a successful conclusion. Those cases which attract public and media attention are only the most visible part of the work of the service, which day in and day out across Scotland successfully prosecutes crime and secures the fair and effective administration of the criminal law. I think it is important that I say that at this, my first appearance before your committee, because I know that some of the evidence that you've received has reflected negatively on the service. I take seriously the issues that have been raised in the evidence before you, but the starting point for addressing the work of the service should be this, that the Crown Office and Procurator Fiscal Service is an organisation which day in and day out fulfills its basic fundamental public responsibilities as the prosecutor of crime in Scotland and does so effectively. The second point I'd like to make at the outset is that this is an organisation which over the past 15 years has shown a remarkable capacity for change. It was at the forefront in Scotland of recognising the needs of victims of crime. It has adjusted rapidly to significant developments in the law, and it embraces the potential of technological advance and procedural reform. The service had already identified some of the issues which have been raised in the evidence before you, and we will be glad to address specific issues which you wish to raise with us. But what the evidence taken as a whole really demonstrates is the case for reform of the criminal justice system. You will be aware that we're at an unusual moment where significant reform across the justice system is in prospect, and we would, I believe, fail the people whom we serve if we were not to grasp the opportunities of that moment. And I'm certainly committed, and I know the Crown Agent is committed, to working with all the agencies involved as we seek to create a justice system which reflects the needs of 21st century Scotland. And finally, if I might make just a brief observation about the budget, I have to take a realistic view about the pressures on public sector funding. The revenue and capital budgets of the service are the same in cash terms as last year. That is the basis upon which the service has undertaken its forward financial planning. You will no doubt wish in a moment to look in detail at the budget figures, but I would like to make clear to the committee at the outset that the service will continue with this budget allocation to prosecute crime in the year ahead effectively, rigorously, and in the public interest.
Thank you. Can I remind members that this evidence session is on the 2017-18 Crown Office budget, and just to stress again, it's not the wider issues raised during our current inquiry. Obviously, there will be a slight overlap, and I'll allow a little bit of latitude on that. But in general, the session is about the budget, and the Lord Advocate will be attending early in the new year to answer questions about the issue during the inquiry. With that, can I open it to questions from members? Douglas Ross, John Finney.
Thank you, Convener, and good morning, Mr Harvey and Lord Advocate. Could I first of all ask the Lord Advocate, on your submission through Mr Harvey, there's a statement made that to protect your constitutional independence, the Lord Advocate deals directly with the Cabinet Secretary for Finance. Can I ask, when you go into these meetings, are you the Crown Office's representative in the Scottish Government or the Scottish Government's representative in the Crown Office when you go into those particular discussions?
Yes, I think the short answer is I am the Lord Advocate, and as Lord Advocate I am the head of the prosecution system in Scotland. That's a function that I exercise independently, both by statute and for constitutional reasons. So I go into those discussions as the Lord Advocate with my responsibilities as Lord Advocate in my mind.
But you do have, dual responsibilities as a member of the government and a member and the head of the Crown Office. So I wonder, when you are dealing on financial terms with a fellow member of the government, which priority do you lead with? Is it for the Crown Office within the Scottish Government, or a Scottish Government member on behalf of the Crown Office?
I think it's perhaps artificial to seek to divide up my different functions. I go into those discussions, as I go into any discussion, I go into as Lord Advocate, as the independent head of the system of prosecution in Scotland. I have to be, as the head of any public service in Scotland has to be in the current environment, I have to be realistic about the public financial circumstances that we live in. But my responsibility is to prosecute crime in Scotland effectively, rigorously, fairly and independently.
So if you can't differentiate with the way I'm trying to ask that question, which of these two statements would you agree with most? As you come out of that meeting with the Cabinet Secretary for Finance, would you agree more with the Scottish Criminal Bar Association, who say it's absolutely astonishing that the Scottish Government should cut the Crown Office budget, or would you agree with Derek Mackay that it's a sound settlement for the service?
I think the first thing to be clear about is that in terms of the revenue and capital budgets, the service will receive the same cash funding as it received last year.
I'll come on to that.
And I know that you'll want to look in detail at that proposition, and I understand that.
But those are two quite stark responses from different sides. The Scottish Government ministers are saying it's a sound settlement for your service, yet the Scottish Criminal Bar Association says it's absolutely astonishing that there should be cuts to the budget. So which one would you think is more accurate?
It's a settlement which is consistent with the forward financial planning of the service. It's a settlement within which I'm confident that we will continue to prosecute crime effectively in Scotland in the coming year. It's a settlement which I'm advised is consistent with the settlement for other justice agencies, broadly speaking. So from that point of view, it's a settlement which enables me in the forthcoming financial year to fulfil my public responsibilities.
So just because I'd like clarity on this, because there is some confusion, do you agree with the Cabinet Secretary for Finance that it's a sound settlement for the service, or do you agree with the Criminal Bar Association for Scotland, which says it's absolutely astonishing that there should be cuts to the COPFS budget?
Well, it's a sound settlement for the service on the basis I've just described to you. For the reason I mentioned a moment ago, I think to describe it as a cut in the way that Mr. Ross articulated it is not not the full picture.
Is there a real terms reduction in your budget?
There is a real terms reduction because...
and you think that's a sound settlement?
Because we have secured in revenue and capital terms the same cash as last year. There is an important point which I know you'll want to discuss, and it may be that the Crown Agent will be better placed than I am to discuss the detail of it, but 1.4 million, or an apparent reduction of 1.4 million, is, as I understand it, a change in the allowance made for depreciation. Doesn't affect the cash that's available for the running of the service.
I will come on to that if I can, but if we take a look at your level 3 funding, do you have that? Do we have that? Well, for example, staff costs in 2016-17 were 73.4 million. In 2017-18, there'll be 72.3 million. That's a real terms reduction in staff costs. Office costs remain the same. Therefore, there's a reduction there. Centrally managed costs, I think, is what you've just touched on, but if that's not the case, I'd be interested in more information. If you look at the headline figures on table 14.2, which is the level 2 spending, there is a £4 million reduction, and I know that's been explained in Mr. Harvey's letter. But I would be interested, first of all, in terms of the level 3 funding, do you accept there is a real term decrease in the funding available, for example, staff costs?
It's perhaps more sensible if Mr. Harvey responds to that.
So the position in terms of, so if you perhaps take it hierarchically in terms of the initial position in relation to the 4 million and then my assessment in relation to the 1.7, and then I'll come down to the staffing, if I may.
No, I'd rather you start with staffing because I'll come on to the other issues. So staffing was my question in this case. Is there a real terms reduction from last year's budget to this year's budget for the amount of money you can spend on staffing? Yes or no?
So we have a real terms reduction in our perspective on the revenue budget of around £1.4 million. And our estimate is that 50% of that cut in revenue in real terms will have to be achieved by non-staff costs and 50% by staffing costs.
So yes would be an answer.
Yes, but I'm trying to give more detail.
Yeah, no, that's useful. But to get a clear answer for the record, there is a reduction in the amount of money the Crown Office will be able to spend on staff with this sound settlement which was delivered by the Scottish Government, in their words, not mine.
So we will have a 1.4 million cut in revenue.
Yeah, and 50% of that.
So what we're planning for is 50% savings on staff costs and 50% on non-staff.
And I don't know, maybe this is more for the Lord Advocate. Given the evidence we've received at this inquiry, do you think that's sensible to be going forward with a reduction in staff costs at a time when we've been told by numerous witnesses, almost unanimously, that in fact you need more resources? No one has questioned the ability of your staff. Indeed, that has been praised time and time again. But it has been said at almost every session that they are under-resourced, and therefore if you are going to implement a cut in the staffing budget, does that not give concerns for the future of the service this year?
I think it's important to, when one's thinking about the future of the prosecution service, not to look at it in isolation from the wider criminal justice system. As I said a moment ago, we are at a moment when we are looking at systemic change, which is likely to alter the system in ways which will make it much more acceptable from the perspective of victims, witnesses, and indeed accused persons. I think it's a mistake. It's a mistake to think that one solves challenges and difficulties simply by putting additional resources into it, rather than looking at...
That may be your opinion, though. However, what I was trying to get across in my question was the opinion from numerous witnesses to this committee is that more resources are required. If you don't feel that's a requirement, then we'll hear that from you in January. But at a time when all these witnesses are saying that an important inquiry, which you said was very timious and you were very interested in the outcomes, if we have people who are at the coalface telling us we need more resources, yet they see this budget settlement from the Scottish Government, presumably agreed in consultation with you, that actually sees a reduction in the amount of money you can spend on the staff within that service, I'm not sure how you can marry up those two statements.
Well, because for two reasons. First of all, the service has planned for the coming year on the basis of the assumption or the scenario of the same cash and revenue and capital terms, and that is the settlement that we have achieved. Secondly, in terms of specific areas of challenge for the service, I'm interested in looking at ways in which we can perform the various functions we have to perform more effectively by looking at procedural changes, looking at changes in the way that we do things. I'm interested in the potential, which is very real, for changes in the justice system across the piece, of which Crown Office is only one part. And all of that has implications for resourcing. I think it's not correct to think that the only way to solve our problem is simply to apply more resources to it.
Yeah.
But can I just make this clear, Mr. Ross? If I am satisfied exercising my responsibility as Lord Advocate, that in order to fulfil the fundamental functions of the service, I require additional funding from the government, I won't hesitate to ask for it.
But you've not asked for it in this settlement.
And I can give an example. In the period of my predecessor's office, when he sought and was given additional funding, which at that time was required specifically to deal with a series of significant cases. Yeah. If again I'm faced with a specific demand, a specific need which requires more funding, and I'm satisfied that in the exercise of my public responsibilities I need more funding for that purpose, then I will ask for it.
Yeah. I worry then that we have a scenario where you have to go cap in hand to the Scottish Government asking for more money, rather than seeing at this time, when you go into your discussions as the independent head of the Crown Office with the Cabinet Secretary for Finance to get a sound settlement, which he described it as in Parliament. You have reiterated a similar view today, yet the FDA union, when they came to this committee to give evidence, Fiona Eadie said, I fully expect our senior manager to give evidence to the Parliament and say he can probably just about manage to deliver the same service again with the same money next year. She then went on to say, however, if the committee wants to see the sorts of improvements that we have spoken about today and the standard of service that we all want to deliver and that the people of Scotland expect, additional resources are required. I'm not sure that Fiona Eadie, people in the FDA union, or anyone having watched the evidence sessions of this committee or experiencing the issues that have been raised here in the court system up and down the country will take much comfort from your answer today.
Yes. Would I like to have more money? Well, there'd be no head of any public service in Scotland who wouldn't like to have more by way of resources. Can I deliver a prosecution service which is fundamentally doing the job it is there to do, which is to prosecute crime effectively, rigorously and fairly, with the settlement that we've achieved? I believe that I can. And I should say that I was very pleased, Mr. Ross, that at the outset you acknowledged the evidence about the quality of the staff in the service, because, and I've been very pleased to read the evidence that you've received about the quality of the staff, because that vindicates something I've been saying from my very first day in office, which is to emphasise the trust and confidence I have in the staff who prosecute on my authority up and down Scotland.
Finally, maybe just so we can answer both points, because the convener won't give me much more leeway. Can I ask you to also answer Mr Harvey about the element of your submission that speaks about the 0.95 million that was transferred in year, and that was for Violence Against Women initiative, and that will also be provided during 2017-18. If you know that now, why is that not included in the budget figures presented to Parliament?
It wasn't included in the budget figure for the initial position last year either. It's because it's received in year.
Yep.
So we normally get that around September or October, and we know there's a line in the Justice budget, and there's a commitment that that funding will be delivered.
But when you speak about the 2016-17 draft budget compared to the actual budget, surely that would be known for this year's draft budget as well. Yet it's being included after the draft budget settlement.
It's received the same treatment as it did last year when we presented that.
Well, that's my question. Why should it receive the same treatment as last year? Why can't it just go in, if you know you're getting that funding, why doesn't that 9.95 million go in?
It could equally be presented that way, but we've presented it consistently as we did last year in relation to it being funding that will arrive during the course of the year rather than funding that we start the year with.
And how often have you received that funding?
This will be the third year, and it's the final year of that particular funding commitment.
Okay.
Stephen,
sorry, I think Mr Harvey wanted to answer an earlier
question. If I may, convener, there's also a matter about how you spend money, and I think it may assist the committee to understand, regardless of what funding we have available for staffing, the choices that are being made. It may assist the committee to know that there are up-to-date figures in relation to numbers of legal staff. We now have 533 members of legal staff. The high point in the entirety of the service was 2009-10 when we had 547. So it's about 14 away from the all-time high, and has actually been growing each year for the last 3 or 4 years. The other thing that in terms of decisions in relation to frontline staff, our core staff grades of depute and senior depute, since 2009 the figure was 285 and the figure now is 354. So choices are being made within the envelope that is available to us in order to ensure that we invest in staff who are in the courts.
A supplementary, Stuart?
It's a narrow technical point that relates to where Mr Ross started on the relationship between the Lord Advocate and the government. The Scotland Act of 1998, I understand, appoints members to the government under Section 45 of that Act, appointing the First Minister. Section 47 of that Act, which appoints the people we now describe as Cabinet Ministers, but the Act describes as Ministers. People who are appointed under Section 49 is described in the Act, junior ministers, are not members of the government. But at no point in the appointment of members of the government does it include the Lord Advocate. So am I correct in assuming that in legal terms you are an advisor to the Scottish Government as well as being head of the prosecution service, but you are not a member of the Scottish Government?
That in fact is incorrect. By statute, the law officers are members of the Scottish Government in the same way that the Attorney General in England and Wales is a member of the UK Government. But the Lord Advocate exercises what are called retained functions, which are the functions as head of the system of prosecution and investigation of deaths. Those are functions which the Lord Advocate exercised long before devolution over many centuries, and which are exercised by statute and constitutionally independently of any other person. And those are the particular functions that we're here to discuss today.
So you're a man of two hats, two brains, and you leave some of them outside of the door when you meet with the government as a member of the government.
Well, I am very clear that as head of the system of prosecution, and when I exercise my retained functions, the responsibilities rest with me and with me alone.
Thank you.
Thank you for that clarification, John Finney, followed by Rona.
Thank you, Convener. Good morning, gentlemen. Thank you for your written evidence and your opening remarks. And I'm glad, Lord Advocate, that you picked up the very clear message we got, that there was no criticism whatsoever of the staff, that the highest standards are appreciated that we go through. I'd like to ask a few short questions to Mr. Harvey, please. And it's picking up on the point that Mr. Ross made about this settlement of just under £1 million for violence against women, and the fact it is recurring. In the paragraph, when you allude to that, Mr. Harvey, you conclude by saying, and I quote here, "This means that whilst it looks as though our cash settlement is decreased and expenditure and staff costs is reduced, in fact it is not." Can you maybe just... In cash terms.
In cash terms. In real terms, there's undoubtedly a decrease in revenue and a small decrease in capital. The figure that was used in the briefing, I think overall, was a reference to 4 million, which made reference also to the depreciation sum. The reality is that in terms of funding actually available to the service, in real terms, our calculation is it's approximately 1.5 million in revenue and about 100,000 in capital is the real terms impact.
Okay, thank you. Excuse me, thank you for that. I was also going to ask about what you refer to as our expected depreciation profile, because you also talk about medium-term financial strategy that you were following. And I was just wondering, is this settlement, regardless of its merits, is it within the scope of what you had been considering?
It is within the scope of the various projections that we had considered.
Thank you. Excuse me. Something I was astonished by, and I don't know if it is a misprint, but it's the phrase in here, some 7.5% of our budget is currently spent on mortuary and pathology costs.
Indeed.
Is that correct?
Yes.
It seems an astonishing figure.
It's millions of pounds.
And what opportunity? I know you allude to opportunities. I mean, the Christie principles of collaborative working, are they being fully examined in relation to that to reduce that cost?
They are being, we do consider, and that's why we've highlighted it there, that there will be opportunities going forward in relation to that service provision.
And there has been a petition at this Parliament about mortuary facilities. I don't know if you're aware of that. If perhaps that's something, it comes from a woman in Murray and her concerns about facilities. Maybe something you could look at, an opportunity again there maybe.
All of those factors would be as part of our consideration going forward in relation to how we deal with those contracts.
Thank you. And you talk about the appointment of a Director of Procurement. Is there any projection as to, and that's also in relation to the reletting of contracts and improved contract management. There's also mention of a telecoms contract that has recently been relet. Are you able to give any indication of savings in relation to that, please?
The telecoms contract we anticipate will be saving in excess of 15%. It will also deal with some of the issues that the committee has heard with, from other witnesses from in relation to the difficulties with the 08 number. It will be an 03 number. The 03 number enables members of the public or solicitors who have mobile packages. An 03 number counts towards that for 3 minutes, etc. And also it has the same overall cost as an 01 or an 02 number.
Also, finally, Mr. Harvey, you talk about overall staff numbers will start to reduce. Can you give any indication if that would include fiscal deputy at all?
It may, but we would be seeking to avoid that situation where possible. As I said, we've made it very clear that, this goes back to my answer to Mr. Ross, that there are choices available to us in the staffing profile as we go forward. One of the things that we have done in the past, and quite dramatic changes, there were historically, I think, 2009, 39 senior civil servants in the organisation, it's now down to 24. And so those types of choices, I use that simply for illustration, and enable us to select, in terms of what we assess our demand might be, what the best options would be to deal with that.
Okay, thank you very much indeed.
Rona?
Yes, good morning, Lord Advocate and Mr. Harvey. I'm very pleased to see that there'll be no compulsory redundancies and that you're hoping to achieve savings through digitisation of processes and sheriff and duty reform. I just wanted to ask you a wee bit about your long-term financial planning. Your submission talks about your medium term. The Auditor General has told us that she's emphasised the benefits of long-term financial planning. How realistic is it for you to be able to do that at this stage?
We are engaging in that exercise, and it's actually been a very fruitful one. I noted with interest the Auditor General's evidence, and it's fair to say that having embarked on that exercise, we've found it extremely beneficial. We have had extremely significant assistance and advice from both the Auditor General's office, but also from our own internal audit and from our non-executives. And so as part of the financial sustainability plan, there were a number of assumptions, risks, etc., for a variety of different scenarios that were identified. And we have tested those robustly, including with the internal and external auditors and with the non-executives, all of whom were very positive about the approach that we were taking and have contributed towards those exercises. So we feel as if we are in a significantly more robust position, both in the medium and long term. I think it came out in the evidence to the auditor, and I think there was some question and debate about the value the longer out you look, and I think that's fair, but the key with that is to continually to revisit it. So I would regard this as something that has been a really positive development that certainly has assisted us greatly in relation to scenario planning, and it is something that we will be constantly revisiting in the months and years to come.
Thank you. Thank you.
Liam, you wanted to continue that line of question?
Yeah, I think you've heard from a number of members the evidence we've received about the quality of the work that's done within the service, but a constant refrain has been around the problems created by having such a large number of staff on short-term contracts, and I think the Auditor General made the point that in terms of deriving best benefit from the investment you're making in training and all the rest of it, that doesn't seem to be a sound strategy, albeit that I think she recognised, as has been suggested in the evidence to us, that some level of short-term contracts are probably going to be required to manage kind of peaks and flows. Could you perhaps talk through in a little more detail what precisely is envisaged in terms of the workforce planning that will allow you to move more of the staff onto or away from short-term contracts?
Development, and it's actually one of the things that's been, in a strange way, quite encouraging to hear during the evidence, because as the Lord Advocate touched upon, a number of the things that have come out in evidence were already matters that we had been identified and were working through, and so the workforce strategy had already recognised that there was a significant issue in relation to the balance of permanent to fixed term staff. For a variety of reasons, obviously, as you've rightly identified, training and retraining costs, but also separately, just that sense of cohesion with teams, people knowing that the people that they're working with will be there long term, and it's worthwhile not only training them, but investing time and improving the culture. So I personally am determined that balance will change dramatically. People will comment on the timing. The timing is completely coincidental, just in terms of the product of that planning now coming to fruition. But as an indication in advance of Christmas, which was my intention, I actually sent out a message earlier this week indicating that two things. First of all, in relation to those staff who are on a temporary promotion, and again that's an issue. There are quite large numbers that are on temporary promotion in percentage terms. That's something that in first quarter of the financial year we'll be seeking to address in order to identify those posts that are demonstrably permanent and seeking to fill them permanently at that grade. And then separately, and in addition to that, both in terms of the administrative staff and the legal staff, there's a similar exercise that requires to be conducted that is now coming to fruition, which we envisage will enable us to recruit a number of staff, a significant number of staff, on a permanent basis from within the existing pool on a competitive basis.
Talk about a dramatic change. I mean, I certainly welcome what you're saying, which does seem to go some way to addressing the concerns that we've been hearing over recent weeks. But you talk about a dramatic change against the backdrop of what Mr Ross was exploring with you of staff reduction costs over the next financial year. How are you accommodating that? What's presumably this is going to put additional stress on your staff budget, even if it gives you greater predictability.
It gives greater predictability, and again, one of the benefits of the approach that we've taken is that it's given us an opportunity to scenario plan in a situation where we have the sort of settlement that we have. The reality is we're already paying for these people, if you like, and they're already making a significant contribution. The issue is the impact that would have in the medium to longer term by making the commitment to make them permanent. So one of the things that we have done is looked through the numbers that leave the service for other reasons, whether it's retirement, getting jobs elsewhere, etc., through natural wastage, I think is the term that's used, which is a horrendous term, but you know what I mean. And actually making very, very significant proportions of the temporary staff permanent. Still looking at that figure of natural departures, we would have the ability to flex in accordance with the types of pressures that we've identified this year.
Just looking at the budget profile over recent years, and we heard from the Auditor General, I think, criticism in only the way the Auditor General can provide it, that this really should have been being done from a number of years back. Why is it we're seeing the decision to move to more permanent contracts and a greater stability in the service now, when there isn't a great deal of change in the budget? Presumably these decisions could have been taken 2-3 years ago at the very least.
There have been some changes in the budget that help inform that decision. I think there are also just points about decisions having to be made. So, for example, there was additional funding a couple of years ago that has now been baselined in budget, which I think gives us greater certainty. But also beyond that, there is no doubt that we have, I think, reached a critical mass where it has become an issue, and it's a matter which, on the back of the workforce planning, we have a far greater level of confidence that we can now address proactively, and that's what we will be doing in the first quarter of the year.
And just one other issue again that's come up quite routinely through the evidence we've taken is the concern about the implications of the move to centralised marking. And one of the arguments in favour of it has been the additional level of expertise that can be brought to bear in a more centralised system, but also the efficiencies it gives to the service. Now, given the concerns that we've heard, clearly what is in place at the moment, to my mind, does not appear to be working. What is your view of the efficiencies of the savings this system allows you to generate within the budget? And what would the financial implications of going, in a sense, back to a system where there'd be more localised input or localised marking?
I wonder if I might just make an introductory comment and then let the Crown Agent deal with the more operational aspect of the question. My own view is that for a national prosecution service, it is not acceptable today to have anything other than national standards and national criteria. The national case marking arrangements allow us to secure consistency in the way that marking decisions are made across the country. And it's fair to say, and Crown Agent is better placed now to speak to this, that the use of or the doing of marking, as it were, away from the local area is not a new phenomenon. It's become systematized in the national case marking arrangements. The arrangements that are in place are able to accommodate particular needs, particular local variations through the systems that are in place. But by approaching marking on a national basis, we're able to address the need for local variation in a systematic manner, if I put it that way.
Does that not kick against the fact that individual judges, individual JPs have done and always will come at issues with a particular perspective that it will influence the way in which they come to a conclusion. So even with national marking, you're still going to find that there will be variability in terms of what each court comes up with by way of a conclusion, maybe not necessarily in the measures. But one of the concerns is there's a lack of understanding about the options open to dealing with a particular case because it's centrally marked.
Well, my understanding is that the systems in place are able to accommodate and provide the relevant information to those doing the marking. I'm making the more perhaps the more fundamental point, which is that for a National Prosecution Service, it seems to me right that we approach criminality across Scotland in a consistent manner. So, I'd like to. I think it's important.
We'll come back to this in January because I know we're straying into that, but
yes.
The budgetary elements of this, I think, are probably more relevant.
Well, we will come back to this in January, and we welcome the opportunity to discuss in more detail. But I think there's a fundamental point I need to make to start, which was that this wasn't a binary situation of individual cases being marked in 40-odd offices across the country and then all of a sudden in national hubs. The reality is that centralised marking in a variety of different forms has existed within the service for many years. And indeed under the previous federation structure, which I think you've heard some evidence about as well, there were federation hubs as well. So there was a logical extension in the creation of that model. And I think that one of the misconceptions that has been in some of the evidence, which again I'd be happy to touch on more in detail in January, is that all of a sudden, as a result of the creation of NICP, that in some way this meant that there was a loss of local contact. The building of NICP was very carefully developed in order to try and ensure that the localism was protected. There is a preponderance of diversion schemes across the country. And again, I think that's something that it would be helpful as a Justice Committee if perhaps we could talk about in January in the context of a national marking hub, appreciating what is available in local areas and also whether or not there's an issue about the availability of certain options in local areas. But that's a matter that we can discuss then. But it's fair to say from our perspective, one of the key benefits in terms of efficiencies, etc., is actually you've got an identifiable group of people who, for example, in relation to the prosecution policy review, when you introduce a change in policy, you have a targeted group of individuals who you can introduce with intensive training, and they are responsible for the vast bulk of the marking that's then created, as opposed to having to train larger numbers as intensively. So there are a variety of things, not just in relation to efficiencies in relation to numbers, but also going forward, the ongoing costs of supporting that model creates in itself some efficiencies. I would like to say, though, that the staff in NICP, in keeping with the evidence that you've heard, have done extraordinarily well with a new model, but we are also not insisting that the model as defined isn't capable of refinement. And one of the things that's been really beneficial from the inquiry is to look at the evidence that does relate to that, and that will be fed in relation to seeking to further improve that approach.
Yeah, I think the point specifically that's been raised in evidence is the fact that central marking would dispose of a case in a certain way. It might be a fixed penalty fine. The person may appear several times thereafter not paying that fixed penalty fine. And there could have been local disposals that perhaps centrally, as a result of them being centrally marked, they weren't aware of, that would more effectively have dealt with that case. And the budgetary position here, the financial implication is people are turning up time and time again unnecessarily, perhaps at a local level, because it hasn't been dealt with properly. And the indication we received was because there wasn't a knowledge of the potential and possible referrals that could have been made. So is that something that you've taken on board from the inquiry?
I've heard that evidence. I've also seen the supporting evidence. So, for example, there was some evidence about the decreased use of diversion schemes, but then when the evidence was submitted that didn't really demonstrate that level of decrease, it suggested that there was, the knowledge was still there. I think that was the SACRO evidence, where a large number of the options that were available, actually the numbers appear to have increased. So I think that, again, it's perhaps something that we can explore in further detail in January. In terms of the availability of diversion schemes, suitable diversion schemes are something that I personally, and I know prosecutors across the country, are enthused about as a constructive way of dealing with criminality to avoid repetition. But insofar as the penalties are concerned, as and when those penalties are awarded, it's fair to say that the figures that we have, which again I'm very happy to provide to the committee, indicate that I think there was a suggestion that people were just getting repeated fixed penalty notices or fiscal fines. And I think we have some information there in relation to the numbers that might assist the committee in more detail. Possibly best if I don't go into them just now, but I think we might be able to provide you with some reassurance in relation to their use and the recovery.
Does the amount of unpaid fines cause you some concern?
I think the evidence, again, from Mr McQueen was that the evidence was that the recovery was about 80%. And I think that in relation to court fines, the numbers are slightly higher. Forgive me, I don't have that evidence to hand.
And in monetary terms?
In monetary terms?
How much isn't collected?
Well, from record, well, it'd be 20%. I don't know what that figure would be.
Are we going into millions?
I don't know. I don't have that figure, but I'll get that figure for you in January.
Perhaps that would be a good figure to see, because 80% sounds very good, but equally, if there's millions then being unpaid, then that's money that could be into the system. Could I ask Mary Fee and then Fulton?
Thank you, Convener, and good morning. Apologies for the voice. I'll try not croak too much. I wanted to ask a further question about the savings that you plan to make from staff costs. Given the huge legislative changes there's been in the last few years that have affected the way the Crown Office works, and further changes in legislation that will have an impact on the work of the Crown Office, are you confident that given the size of the savings that you have to make, there will be no impact on the service you provide, but also that you will be able within the budget to properly train and support the staff that you have to carry out the services they do, and given that there will be an increase in specialist services and specialist courts, which adds another dimension, are you confident that you have enough given the savings you're going to have to make?
Yes. Perhaps I could again just make a couple of high-level observations and then ask the Crown Agent to comment specifically. I suppose the first point to make is that this is a service which has absorbed remarkable changes over the course of my professional lifetime. I was an advocate depute when we were dealing with the arrival of disclosure with the effects of Saldus and Cadder. It's a service which was at the forefront of recognising the needs of victims of crime and responding to them. So it's a service that, in the course of my professional lifetime, has embraced change, has absorbed significant changes, and I've every reason to be confident that it's a service that will go on being able to adapt to change and to deal with the challenges that that face it. So that's a general observation about the capacity of the organisation and its approach to the changing environment. In terms of specialism, you're absolutely right that the world is becoming more specialist. Within the COPFS, there are now specialist units that deal with a variety of different aspects of criminality. Scotland was, I think, at the forefront in relation to sexual offending by setting up the National Sex Crimes Unit. So specialism, again, is something that the service has shown itself comfortable with, if I can put it that way. I think as one goes forward and looks at future legislative change, I think one will have to look at each set of proposals on its own merits. There will be changes which will impose demands on the service, and there will be changes, particularly if one's looking at the broader potential of criminal justice reform and the kind of work that's being done through the Scottish Court Service Evidence and Procedure Review. There may be changes that will have benefits for the public at large and may alter the kind of work that the service needs to do. So I think it would be very difficult to give any sort of short answer other than to say that this is a service which has shown itself able to absorb changes in the external environment, change in legislation, and I'd have confidence that it would continue to do so. But the Crown Agent may wish to add his own remarks.
I agree with you in relation to the importance of training, it perhaps might assist the committee. In contrast to 2011, we've increased the amount of money that we spend on training by 75%. That's across a range of different topics, not only the specialisms that the Lord Advocate has pitched up, has referred to, but also in relation to other matters like the development of our managers and our leaders within the organisation, so that we do invest in training. Insofar as the legislation going forward is concerned, for example, in relation to the new domestic abuse bill, we are in discussion with Scottish Government officials in preparing a financial memorandum for that bill, and those discussions are ongoing.
Okay. So in relation to the budget that you have for training, is the budget for training increasing while the budget for staff costs is decreasing?
We haven't managed to increase the budget on training by 75%. During the course of the 5-year period that I've described. But at the same time, you'll recall that during the 5 years that I've described, we were also able to increase staffing numbers. So against the budget constraints that we've already had to deal with over the last several years, we have actually been able to make, I would suggest, some very positive choices in relation to investing in training and investing in staff. We now have over 1,600 full-time equivalent staff again, which, again, if you look at the pattern over the last 3 to 5 years, is actually an increase, notwithstanding the constraints that we've been subject to. So it's about making intelligent choices within what's available to us.
Lord Advocate and Mr Harvey for attending today. My question has already really been covered and kind of follows on from Mary Fee's question. I mean, obviously, you've identified that you need to live in the current financial circumstances, and the funding cuts that's coming from the Westminster government are well documented. Can I ask, though, in terms of the specialist areas, are you confident in continuing to meet and develop the domestic violence agenda and continuing to prosecute in the vein that you have been over the past period?
Thank you. Short answer is yes.
Great.
I can elaborate on that if you would like.
Yes, please.
And I'm conscious we may be, there are a number of issues that have been raised in the course of the evidence in your inquiry, which you may wish to come back and discuss with us.
So sorry, I should have said, yeah, in my opening remarks that I'm talking specifically about the funding that you're getting for the violence against women.
Yes.
And if that is enough to maintain the current standard of prosecution.
Well, as the Crown Agent said, I mean, we expect of the same funding in year transferred to support the work on violence against women, and that's a specific piece of funding directed to seeking to ensure that these cases are dealt with as expeditiously as possible, and the figures would support the view that it's been successful in that regard. I have no reason to believe that we won't continue to be able to do that.
If I may expand with a little more detail. So we have the funding for a further year. It might assist the committee if I give some of the tangible benefits that have resulted from that £2.4 million in funding each year to ourselves and the court service. Part of it is allocated to the court service, part of it has been allocated to COPFS, and that has enabled us to recruit additional prosecutors and administrative staff specifically for these purposes. It involved a lot of excellent joint work with the court service, and the net result is that in the first 2 years, the number of sheriff court trials outstanding dropped from 23,500 to 16,900. And in the JP courts from 11,800 to just over 9,000, which is a collective reduction of just under 9,500 trials. And in terms of additional courts during that 2-year period that wouldn't otherwise have been able to run, there were 647 extra Justice of the Peace courts and over 1,100 extra sheriff courts. So if it assists the committee, that's an example of what £2.4 million buys.
Yeah. Okay, just a follow-up to that without hopefully straying too much into questions that may be more appropriate for our next session. Do you think that the focus on domestic violence and the focus that you've discussed there could help to reduce it and have a cultural change in the future, thereby, I know we're thinking long term here, but thereby reducing the amount of people that come to court for these type of offences, because we change behaviour, we change attitudes towards this type of offence?
Yes, I mean that you're focusing there very much on the policy question, which is one for me, yeah. And I think there are perhaps 2 or maybe 3 points to make. The first is that this is an area of criminality which for far too long wasn't taken sufficiently seriously by the criminal justice system. The second point to make is that when I or the service prosecute a domestic abuse case, we prosecute it because a crime has been committed. And I take the view that it is correct, where there is sufficient evidence in law, to have strong presumptions in favour of prosecution of this particular type of offending. I say that firstly because of the impact that it has on victims and other members of a family, particularly children. But I also say it because, as you allude to, against the background of the way historically I think this type of offending was dealt with, it is important the criminal justice system sends out a very clear message about what's acceptable and, more importantly, what's not acceptable in today's Scotland.
If I could just press you a little bit more on that, Lord Advocate, you've that cases are dealt with expeditiously and there's a strong presumption in favour of prosecution, but surely that can't be, as the defence agents have said, where there's a perception that the prioritisation of domestic abuse cases in the context of scarce resources meant that money was sometimes being wasted on cases with little prospect of conviction at the expense of other summary cases. Now, clearly, if that was the case, that's not in anyone's interests. It doesn't make sense financially. It certainly doesn't make sense in emotional terms for the victim or for witnesses, anyone involved.
All of that is correct if that were the case, convener. First point I want to make very clear is that a prosecution should not be brought in relation to any case unless there is sufficient evidence in law. There have been suggestions, I think, in at least one witness's evidence that that basic proposition is not one that's adhered to certainly from my point of view, that's the starting point here. Strong presumption for prosecution presupposes that there's sufficient evidence in law. The second point that I'd like to make is that if one looks at the statistics, in the cases, domestic abuse cases that went to trial last year, a conviction was secured in 80%. Now, I don't think it'll be lost on the committee that these are cases which are maybe inherently difficult to prosecute. They are cases where, for reasons which will be intelligible, complainants are not always, who may initially engage with the system may become unwilling or less willing to give evidence. Notwithstanding these particular difficulties in these particular types of cases, last year convictions were secured in 80% of the cases that went to trial. That doesn't suggest to me that there's a serious, that the kind of problem that you're describing is one which is causing the kind of difficulties systemically that I think the question that you asked, convener, might convey.
I think there'll probably be more questions than that in January, but it was to look at the budgetary at the expense
yes.
of summary cases, which brings me on to churn, if I could just perhaps pursue that for a minute. Do you accept there is churn in the court, that this comes at a cost, and how would you address it?
I certainly accept that, particularly in summary cases, there is churn. There are a variety of reasons for it. The fundamental answer is to look at systemic reform. And I would certainly commend a reading of Part A of the Scottish Court Service's Evidence and Procedure Review, which sets out the vision that the Court Service has for summary justice reform, and which is work which Crown Office is very actively engaged in with other criminal justice partners.
Can I put to you what Derek Ogg told us when he gave the evidence? Derek Ogg from the Faculty of Advocates suggested that the decision to make less use of precognitions based on a lack of resources could actually prolong cases, thus wasting resources.
There has been a change in the approach to precognition. That change followed on the radical changes in the law on disclosure. And the current policy is, follows what's called purpose-driven precognition. In other words, rather than a precognition process which, in which the Crown Office interviews witnesses who have already given police statements, the decision to recognise a witness should be based on a view that there's a particular need to recognise a witness in addition to the police statements which have already been obtained and which are available to the accused and his defence agents.
Again, it's something that we'll pursue in January, but I think there is perhaps a certain art to precognition, which maybe the police don't always have. But that's something maybe...
It's perhaps something to pursue further in January. I mean, I understand the point that's been made, but if the question is this a change which is driven by financial considerations, well, it predated my time. The Crown Agent may be able to say more about it, but my understanding it was a deliberate policy decision taken against the background of the radical change in practice that followed from the change in the law of disclosure.
Well, in answering perhaps, Mr. Harvey, you could address whether, if it wasn't taken for financial reasons, perhaps it's having an impact now financially.
So it wasn't taken for financial reasons. It was taken, as Lord Advocate has said, in relation to changes in disclosure. It also for good or bad, reflected the realities of the way in which trials are conducted these days, particularly, I think it's colloquially known as trial by statement. And so therefore witness positions have become now traditionally crystallised in police statements that can be put to witnesses, which a precognition can't. And one of the key issues was in ensuring that we obtempered our very onerous and important disclosure obligations in a way that enabled the defence to have all of the material and then have that material in a format that enabled them to put it to witnesses. So there were all sorts of positive reasons for going down the route that we've described. And it's not an abandonment of precognition, it's about more focused precognition where we think that that precognition will add value. So for example, in relation to serious sexual offending cases, those cases, it's highly likely, if not nearly always, that that individual would be precognosed. Insofar as the cost and the impact is concerned, I think that is completely intangible because of the way in which the way a trial was conducted has changed so dramatically since disclosure and then since particularly the provision of these police statements that the value or otherwise of what a precognition may or may not have added is speculative.
Can I put something quite tangible that
Sure.
we all saw when we went to the Sheriff Court, and that was many of the procurator fiscals not having the information in front of them, not being prepared, and that precognitions would greatly help them to come to court in the first instance, totally prepared with all the information they need, and therefore avoid the churn.
If you're talking about in sheriff summary cases, there never was any precognition of witnesses. In relation to sheriff and jury cases, there was some limited precognition, and in high court cases, traditionally there was significantly more precognition. So again, in terms of perception and understanding about what was available, certainly when I started as a deputy 20 years ago, when I was prosecuting the summary courts, I had the police report and such police statements as were available, and that remains the position in the summary courts.
Very quickly on that supplementary then, Ben, Douglas and Mary. And I think I'll let Mary in before Douglas after that. Mary, supplementary, very small.
Very, very brief supplementary, and it's just on the issue that you raised, Convener, about churn. I wonder if it's possible to put a figure on the amount of resource that churn wastes. And apologies if there is something in the papers that I've just not picked up. I apologise. But is it possible to put a figure on that?
I'm certainly going to pass that question to the Crown Agent.
Well, the best figure in terms of for the overall system that I've seen is the £10 million figure in the Audit Scotland report on the working of the Sheriff Courts, which I think was published tail end of 2015.
But I'm talking specifically about churn, because churn wastes a lot of time.
That was the figure that they attributed to. It was £10 million per annum for the entirety of the system.
Followed by Mary and then Douglas.
Thank you, Convener. Good morning. One of the common themes that's come up in the evidence that we've taken, particularly from victims of crime, has been how important support for victims and witnesses is. And I was interested to see in table 7.3 of the draft, 7.13 rather, of the draft budget that support for victim and witnesses is near tripling, up to 15.8 million, an increase of 10.4 million. Is my understanding that some of that money will be allocated to third sector organisations that do such important work in this field, but I just wondered if you could comment on what impact you think that increase will make to the service.
I'll let Crown Agent answer that, but perhaps introduce that by affirming the importance, as you allude to, of providing appropriate support to victims. My own view is that as prosecutors, we can't do our job unless we give confidence to victims that they will be enabled to speak up through the justice system. And so it is an important part of the work that prosecutors do. we can't provide all the support that victims need because our primary obligation is to prosecute crime, and that's perhaps an issue we may have to come back to when we come back in January. But with that, by way of a sort of policy introduction, perhaps the Crown Agent can answer the specifics of the question.
If I may preface my remarks by simply saying I would like to put on record my thanks to VIA staff who regularly deal with victims and witnesses in incredibly distressing circumstances. And that is a particularly challenging role in the organisation. And echo the Lord Advocate's point that looking at it from a system perspective, whether the individual who is involved in the system is a witness, a victim or an accused, we want that person to be able to give of their best through the entirety of the process. And it's important that there are mechanisms in place to help them support through that alien environment, which I think we would all accept that it is for many individuals that are involved in it. I do think, however, as the Lord Advocate said, that there are some issues that we need to address at a system level, and again would welcome discussion at committee level about the role of VIA and the role of the prosecutor in providing that level of support and what that level of support should be, and the extent to which other support requires to be available, and I use this word importantly, consistently across the country, in order to ensure that the individuals who find themselves in that situation are assisted in being able to give of their best and supported through the system. Insofar as VIA itself is concerned, again, just for information in terms of the level of commitment that the COPFS has in this area, I think the committee will be familiar that VIA is, in relative terms in the history of COPFS, relatively new. It was only introduced in 2004, and at that stage it was innovative and was one of the first in the world where a prosecution service was offering a level of support and advice and information to victims. And so of the 1,600 full-time equivalent staff, about 103, 104 of them are actually engaged in that activity on our behalf. So about 1 in 16 of our staff are VIA support staff. And again, insofar as the choices that are being made in relation to the use of those funds are concerned, the Band C and D staff, the ones who are dealing with the more serious criminality and supporting victims through the more serious criminality, again, we've been in a position where we've been able to increase the headcount of individuals providing those services, again, making choices about how we use funds.
So, just to be clear, so that extra funding will partially go towards recruitment of more VIA staff in order to support that work, or those decisions still to be made?
The extra funding that's identified in other budget lines does not come to COPFS. These will be for other service providers, and that's why I'm saying about the role of VIA and the role of other service providers, and the line that would be appropriate constitutionally for a prosecution service to offer a level of support, but acknowledging those understandable and legitimate expectations, the needs of victims and witnesses beyond those parameters. And so it's encouraging that funding will be available, but it will not directly come to COPFS, albeit I would hope that we would benefit, and that everyone in society would benefit from the investment in individuals feeling more supported as they go through this alien process.
Understood, and thanks for clarifying that point. I look forward to discussing in the new year around the policy and systemic potential for greater supporting witnesses and victims. Thank you.
Thank you, Convener. I mean, my initial question was actually answered by the Lord Advocate. It was a supplementary to your own, and it was to specifically ask about what the conviction rates were for domestic abuse cases. So thank you very much for providing that figure. And it was really following on from Ben McPherson's line of questioning there, and it was specifically about VIA and what you've talked about in your evidence here. Because obviously, speaking to victims who've either been through the service, I mean, you can only imagine how disorienting it is trying to navigate around that system. And I don't think that reports on VIA were always the most positive. And it was really how you talk about the 60 recommendations there and how the implementation of that is underway. I'm not expecting you to outline all the 60 recommendations here, but just what sort of areas are you looking at in terms of that, and how is the implementation of that progressing?
So it's a phased implementation, and so there will be further recommendations that were required to be implemented during the course of the next calendar year. One of the first elements was, I think it's also highlighted in evidence that as part of our move back towards a sheriffdom-focused local court delivery, there required to be a reframing of the VIA structure to accommodate that. But also perhaps more significantly, in light of recent legislative changes, the numbers of referrals that VIA are dealing with have gone up quite dramatically, and I think again that's referred to in some of the additional information that I think we provided to the committee on the earlier stage. You'll recall that there were a series of fact sheets, and I would refer you to those in relation to the detail rather than going over those today in relation to the additional challenges that they face. So part of that was to identify ways in which the processes could be simplified in order to accommodate the increase in demand for particular types of interaction, whilst ensuring that those who require the personal levels of support still maintain that. So it's striking that balance between ensuring that, for example, in relation to those who are deemed vulnerable and who therefore are entitled to support, that those matters are dealt with as expeditiously and effectively as possible, whilst ensuring that there's a focus on those who require additional support.
Okay, thank you very much. I mean, I do have more questions on that, but I think they're probably more appropriate for the next session.
I'm going to bring Rona in before I bring Douglas in to just cover an aspect that we know we haven't fully covered.
Thank you, Convener. The presentation of Crown Office funding in the draft budget includes a breakdown of type of activity, for example, in relation to staff costs, etc. Can you provide, or are you able to provide us with a breakdown of work by area of work, for example, summary cases, solemn cases, or marking? Is it possible for you to highlight the funding allotted to them?
We will be able to do that in more detail, but just by way of headline, the last figures that we have for that in relation to actual spend as opposed to projected spend were 14-15, and I could give you those just now broadly if that helps, or perhaps the convener would prefer if we followed that up in writing.
That would be helpful if you did.
Writing would be fine. Thank you.
Because we're getting to the end of our session, so can the questions and answers be brief, please?
There are two final points, if I may. First of all, on your estate, you say in your submission that non-staff costs of the non-staff cost, the estate is the highest. The only mention of the estate in the budget document is about incorporating the carbon management plan within it. But you go on in your submission to the committee to say that savings will be made here. I wonder what percentage and value have you put on reducing your estate? And could you give further examples? I presume you've not just targeted out with the Central Belt, because in your submission it only mentions Dundee, Aberdeen and Perth. So I wondered what else was happening elsewhere in the country.
There are a number of options that develop as each year progresses. So, for example, when there are lease breaks over the next 4 to 5 years, there will be opportunities to discuss and have choices about whether or not those leases should be renegotiated, whether or not a different venue should be identified, what the footprint requirement will be at those times, and we would be seeking to take those opportunities as we go along. And I think Perth's the classic example of that, where the footprint in terms of estate, in terms of the staff numbers that are in Perth at the moment doesn't need to be as big as it currently is.
And have you set a target in how much money you should save in that term, or percentage of your estate that will be reduced?
I haven't set a target, because what I've asked for is an analysis of what those options look like, because part of the reason why the estate choices will be informed by some of the staffing choices as well. So it means that we have a richer picture of information, but I haven't set a specific target for savings attached to estate as yet.
And finally, could I ask the Lord Advocate, in your direct dealings with the Cabinet Secretary for Finance over this budget, We are very interested in, obviously, our inquiry. I think you've both mentioned how interested you have been in it. It has received a widespread publicity in terms of the evidence that we have received. What direct onus was placed on the evidence we have received at this inquiry in your discussions, either from you or from the Cabinet Secretary for Finance, when you were discussing reducing the real terms budget for COPFS?
Would be, I'm sorry, I'm making a mistake with the buttons here. I don't think it would be appropriate for me to go into the detail of discussions which I have with the Cabinet Secretary. I can say that he is well aware that this inquiry is ongoing.
Can you say that the evidence, which I alluded to in my opening questions, highlighting concerns over resources, were fully explored before the Cabinet Secretary for Finance, in direct dealings with yourself, took the decision to reduce the budget to the Crown Office Procurator Fiscal Service in real terms?
As I said, I don't think it would be right for me to get into the discussions that I have with the Cabinet Secretary.
Thank you for that. Stuart Stevenson.
Just a tiny wee point. It appeared to be suggested that fines come back to benefit the justice system. I can't quite recall where they go. Am I correct in saying they go to the Treasury?
The fines go to Treasury, but other items go to other places, but fines go to Treasury.
Well, I realise that POCA, for example,
yes.
is covered by a different jurisdiction where a capped amount is retained in Scotland. So whether fines are paid or not is quite immaterial to the funding that there is for the criminal justice system in Scotland. That's all I wanted. Thank you.
I realised that as soon as I said it, having looked at that in some detail and looked at the amount of outstanding figures and fines, which is not insubstantial, but I suppose the point is there is a churn continuing as the non-payment, and there certainly is a cost attached to that. There were only two other questions, both related, that we haven't covered, and this will be the last. The committee's been told that the preparation of court cases is not a job that can be done in normal office hours, with prosecutors regularly taking homework to avoid being ill-prepared. Is that a situation you're aware of? And I wonder if you could at the same time address staff organisations having highlighted concerns about the impact of work pressures on staff morale and sickness levels, and perhaps indicating what's been done about this, because clearly there's a huge cost implication and emotional implication in all of these as well.
Perhaps again I could make a couple of observations and let the Crown Agent answer in detail, conscious as I am of the pressure of time. I mean, the first point to reiterate is the point that's already been made by a number of people, that the quality of the staff
Absolutely,
in the Crown Office and the trust that I have in the judgment and professionalism of all the staff who prosecute on my behalf. I recognise that the work of a prosecutor is challenging. It's a challenging job. In terms of morale, I was very heartened to see the most recent civil service survey on the Crown Office, in which I think it's fair to say all the numbers are moving in the right direction. There's still work to be done, but the numbers are going in the right direction. And just to pick out a few examples, 56% of members of staff reported that they had an acceptable workload. Now, I think what's important about that figure is that it's a 15% improvement on the last survey, and it's only 2% below the civil service average. So while one would like to see that move up, it's a figure which is going firmly in the right direction.
Can I ask when the last survey was? What kind of time frame are we talking about?
I think we're talking about 1 year.
1 year.
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
67% reported that they have a good work-life balance, and that's up 11% from last year and is on the civil service average. And then going to questions about working for COPFS, 60% reported that they wanted to stay working for COPFS for at least the next 3 years. That's up 6% and is 17% above the civil service average and 9% above the civil service high performers. So, you know, those figures to me you know, are encouraging.
But every person in the fiscal service has obviously a story to tell. So while percentages may be encouraging, do you accept there's still an issue to be addressed?
Of course, and you know, one of the jobs that I have as the new head of the service is to reinforce to staff the value I place on the work that they do, the trust I have in them, the importance of the professionalism and the dedication that they show.
Yeah. Okay.
I don't know whether the Crown Agent would
unless you want to add anything, Mr. Harvey.
There was obviously quite a lot of detail there, so it's hard to add additional detail. But insofar as I can, the other thing to bear in mind is that part of the way of addressing this is at a system level. So, for example, in October that same month, if you look across the sheriff courts in the country on any given day, in terms of appointments, if you like, places that the prosecutor had to be, that varied between 85 and 120 on any given day across October. So one of the things that we are working alongside the court service is actually trying to stop these peaks in demand, which create an impact and a pressure on the entirety of the system, including on prosecutors. And the other way that we're seeking to mitigate that, referring to my earlier answer, is to ensure that those who most regularly appear in the courts, go back to the figures in relation to deputies and senior deputies, 285 in 2009, 354 in 2016. So in terms of numbers, that's what, an extra 68, 69 in contrast to 2009. So again, trying to make those choices in order to allow as much flexibility as is possible within the constraints that are applied.
And always mindful of the work-life balance.
Absolutely, and it was encouraging to see those results in the survey, but I'm all too conscious that that's just a step in a journey, and that there's a considerable way to go, and perhaps in the next session we might have an opportunity to discuss in some more detail the Fair Futures work that we're doing, in particular in and around well-being. The most recent staff absence figures have shown a slight drop, which is encouraging, but I take nothing from that. It's still far too high.
Okay, thank you very much. That's been a comprehensive session. We look forward to seeing you again in January. I suspend to allow for a change of witnesses. Our next item is item 3, evidence session for the Crown and Procurator Fiscal Service inquiry. This is our 7th week of evidence taking on the COPFS inquiry, and I welcome today's witnesses to the committee's evidence session: Michelle MacLeod, HM, Chief Inspector of Prosecution in Scotland, and Don Lewington, Assistant Inspector, HM, Inspectorate of Prosecution in Scotland. I refer members to paper 3, which is a note by the clerk, and paper 4, which is a private briefing from SPICE, and to the written submissions from the Chief Inspector, which is very much appreciated. And with that, invite questions from members. Can I start by asking, how long is your term of office?
My term of office is an appointment of 3 years, and with an option for that to be extended, and I was fortunate enough to have that option extended, so I have a further period of about 2.5 years until the conclusion of my term.
Okay, thank you. Any questions? Mary.
Thank you, Convener. I would really just like to tease out a bit more about some of the current work that you're involved in and what you do, and how that actually reports back and how that information gets out to the public. Because I think that one of my main concerns from seeing all the evidence that we've had so far is that very few people are aware of the work that you do. So I was really just wondering, yeah, what you are doing and how you intend to tackle that problem.
Yes. From looking at the submissions and listening to the evidence, I have to accept that there seems to be an issue with the awareness of the inspectorate and our profile. If I could just advise, we have a remit to look at any part of the operation of COPFS, and the purpose of being to obviously enhance the service for the public of Scotland and to promote excellence in the service. I act entirely independently in publishing and preparing the reports, but the Lord Advocate can require the inspector to undertake a review or inspection of a particular subject, and I can also choose to undertake a review of a particular subject. And we do that on the basis of looking at areas where we perceive the most risk in terms of reputational damage, in terms of resourcing, as the committee have been discussing this morning, and in terms of for the effective prosecution of crime. And there are a number of factors that we would take into account when looking to analyse risk, current trends, performance data, and the views of stakeholders in the Justice Board and in the criminal justice system generally. We publish all our reports. We have a dedicated website which we publish them, and they get published through the Scottish Government comms with a press release. We do get some interest in the reports. I'm aware that some can be quite technical and legalistic, which may limit some of the interest that we sometimes get. But I would say that in terms of, for example, our last report into FAIs, we did interview 21 persons from 21 different organisations, in addition to COPFS staff, defence solicitors, Shrieval, people from the Shrieval bench. So I think maybe in certain fields we're more people are more familiar with our work than others. And there's some surprising submissions, because we have done a lot of work with individual defence, speaking solicitors in different areas, etc. So maybe the bar associations haven't got a wide appreciation of what we do, but we do try and engage with as many people in the criminal justice system as possible. However, taking account of the submissions made, we have looked at how we can raise our profile, and we have now engaged with social media, and we'll put out our reports in future on social media, and I will look actively at how I can raise the profile of the inspectorate in relation to using that mechanism. If I can say that, yes, in terms of our current programme, I think you asked, sorry, we are currently working on our follow-up report to the management of time limits. When I took up my post, I introduced a rolling programme of follow-up reports, which is identified as good practice for inspectorates. So we have continued that programme. We will then, looking at our complaints handling and feedback report, embark on a follow-up report of that early next year. And as part of that, we're going to look at the right of review for victims that was introduced in July 2015. Feel it fits quite well in with the complaints, feedback and handling report to look at that right and to ensure that it has been properly implemented and that victims are actually getting the right that legislation provided. So we're going to incorporate that as a new part of the review. But our main next substantive report, and we're scoping this at the present, is that we have identified the investigation and prosecution of sexual offences as a high-risk area, and that's the next report that we are going to embark on.
I was just wondering then, as a follow-up to that, and if you undertake investigations, you have recommendations to make to COPFS, how you then work together with them to ensure that those recommendations are implemented, and I mean, what sort of obligations are COPFS under to implement whatever recommendations that you propose?
There's no statutory obligation, but my experience, the purpose of the inspectorate has a lot in common with the purpose of COPFS in that they want to improve and drive up standards. In my time as Chief Inspector, I've completed 4 substantive reports, and in every single one of them, all the recommendations have been accepted by COPFS and the Lord Advocate. As I say, we do follow-up reports. The Crown Office will tend to pull an action plan together following the publication of a report, and a senior civil service will have the lead. During the reports, I share my emerging findings. I discuss issues that we come across in the course of our inspection, and that I feel helps people to understand our final conclusions. So in terms of our recommendations, I've had no difficulty in Crown Office accepting them and accepting the purpose and what we're trying to achieve with the recommendations. And it's probably not surprising, given that we're both wanting to actually improve the service. And if we identify a gap or a perceived risk, then I think it would be quite dangerous of a Lord Advocate or a Crown Agent to simply fly in the face of that, unless there was another approach that they wanted to employ to remedy that mischief.
Thank you. And when you talked in your previous answer about some of the Lord Advocate can ask you to investigate specific areas, I'd just be interested to hear some examples of that, or areas where they've called you in specifically to look at a specific issue.
Yeah. The review of sexual offences will be our my fifth substantive report. Of those, the former Lord Advocate asked me to look at, first of all, it's a priority organ retention. That followed a public concern regarding the discovery of organs that have been retained without the nearest relatives being notified, and I think there were statements made to Parliament about that, and he was very anxious that I took an early look at that when I took up post. And so our first report was on organ retention, not just about addressing the system that had been in place to ensure this was robust, that it couldn't, to avoid this happening again, but as part of that inspection, it became apparent that due to medical advances, there was no need in all but exceptional cases to actually retrain organs, and therefore highlighting that fact has actually meant that it's now very rare and very exceptional for a whole organ to be retained. We did 2 audits to provide more reassurance for the Lord Advocate, and of those audits we only found 1 further case where there had been temporary retention and all the procedures had been undertaken and families had been notified. So that was the first report. The second one again was at the request of the Lord Advocate, although I have to say that if the Lord Advocate's identified something that's a risk, it generally does chime with people in COPFS and myself. And the second one was the management of time limits. And it was the management of time limits report, which is one of the drivers for us now turning to look at the sexual crimes review. I then decided I would like to do, I was conscious they were very process and technical reports, and I decided I'd like to do a customer focus report. There hadn't been an inspection into complaints handling and feedback customer service. So I undertook that, and following that I then undertook the fatal accident report. Again, in conjunction and discussion with the former Lord Advocate, we had identified that there was no real evidence base to understand what was causing delays in the FEIs. There was a lot of anecdotal assumptions, but no evidence base. So we did a case review to give some reassurance about on an evidential basis. And it's myself, in light of the time limits and the increasing business now in the High Court, of which we believe 70% is now sexual crimes, that has identified the next real area that we want to have a look at is sexual offences, and I have instigated that and scoping that review as at present.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, supplementaries?
We're hearing there of a couple of instances of the Fiscal Service asking you to look at something. I just wonder if you might care to comment, does that carry with it the risk that if that happens too often, that overwhelms your independent ability to decide your work programme? While, of course, I properly recognise the value of the fiscal being able to ask you that.
Yeah. What the first point I would say is that the actual findings and recommendations are solely attributable to me, so I'm independent in relation to the outcome of any report, even if it's the Lord Advocate that requested us to look at it. It's not uncommon in inspectorates for the provision for ministers to be able to ask the inspectorate to look at significant areas of risk. The Attorney General in England and Wales can ask the inspector of the Crown Prosecution Service to look at particular areas, as can the Cabinet Secretary with HMICS in Scotland can ask them to look at aspects of policing or the SPA work. So it's not uncommon, and perhaps given that the minister is accountable to Parliament, it's understandable that they have got some independent body that they can seek reassurance or seek an independent review of a particular aspect of the operation of the CRPFS that is causing some concern, whether that's public or whether it's arisen for some particular case. But I agree, the balance needs to be correct. It needs to have an opportunity. We are a very small inspectorate, so we haven't got the capacity to do a great deal of reports. So we want to pick carefully the subjects and that we decide to inspect, ensure we achieve the greatest value for the service and for Scotland. So, but I would go back to my point that if an area is causing concern for the Lord Advocate or key stakeholders or the Justice Board, then it usually it's something that we find that our views coincide with. And in all the areas that we were asked to do, I was very happy to consider those areas, as I felt they were significant areas where we needed to have a proper review and a proper examination of the subject.
Thank you.
Hey, Douglas Ross, followed by Stuart. You have another substantive one later. Yeah.
Thank you, Convener. Can I first of all begin by following on some points that Mary Evans made? I have to say I'm slightly worried that you are speaking about getting on social media to raise awareness. Your office has been established for 13 years. It was established in December 2003,
yes.
And it was established to introduce a measure of accountability which is essential for public confidence. And then you go through the evidence we've received on this committee, and I just pick out a few. Scottish Borders Rape Crisis Centre, I have no awareness of the IPS. Scottish Police Federation. The Scottish Police Federation is not aware of the IPS and cannot comment on its resources or effectiveness. One individual witness to the committee, I have never heard of the Inspectorate of Prosecution. And even more worryingly for me, the Sheriffs Association. The Sheriffs Association, we do not receive information about the IPS or its practices. I'm sorry, I don't believe a Twitter handle is going to overcome these problems of over a decade of being in existence and not being known by the legal profession in which you operate.
Well, I've been opposed for 3.5 years.
No, so sorry, I'm speaking about
the
role of IPS.
I appreciate
it's
that.
not you individually.
No. And I fully accept that. I was just making a point that we have listened to some of the feedback and that we will explore different ways to raise the profile. We do circulate reports to everybody that contributes and to anybody that we think has an interest in the criminal justice arena.
Do the Sheriffs Association have an interest then?
Well, undoubtedly, if they have not on our distribution list, then that is a fault that we will look at. But I can say that we do speak to, in the last 2 reports, we had contributions from sheriffs across Scotland in relation to the FEI's report and in the complaints, no, sorry, in the management time bars report. So we do speak to sheriffs, we do speak to defence agents. As you would expect, we speak to any stakeholder that has an interest. Now, as I've advised, we're about to embark on looking at the sexual offences review, and many of the stakeholders that have already given evidence to this committee will, we will definitely be engaging with them and seeking feedback in relation to the review that we're about to take. And I mean, whilst some have said they don't have much awareness of us, we have had contact. Any event that I attend, I've speak to Women's Aid and various other persons there. So I think, and the Police Scotland, we see in just about every one of our inspections in some capacity, and we saw a lot of people in relation to police work in the FEIs, and we've already started speaking to key stakeholders in the police about, well, we're scoping our sexual offences. So we do see a lot of persons. It is disappointing that there seems to be a lack of awareness, and it is something that we will we are taking seriously, and we will look and see if we've got the right distribution list and where we might be missing a trick. And we will. It's not just about social media, but we will ensure that that our reports get to the right people that can help us raise our awareness.
You've got 2 full-time inspectors. Why do you feel they have to be seconded from the COPFS? They
don't necessarily have to be seconded from COPFS. During the inspection for the complaints handling and feedback, I recruited 2 associate inspectors. One had a police background and one had a health sector background. Clearly, in terms of that inspection, there was less focus on legal issues, and there was less of a requirement to have a prosecutorial background. In fact, it was very much about customer focus. As I say, they came from a different organisation background, and that provided a very helpful perspective. However, having secondees from the prosecution service also brings direct benefits. First of all, obviously they have the legal knowledge of the prosecution service, so we're looking at something like management of time limits, which was technical and legalistic, and there was a lot of legal points raised in that. It was helpful to have colleagues in the team that actually had a prosecution background. In addition, the IT systems of COPS, there's 3 different IT systems in addition to the management information system. Again, having seconded deputies with that knowledge of how to use the systems is very important, because it allows us to interrogate the system with minimise the disruption to COPFS, because we can go in, we can see how many cases of a particular type, we can access the files, we can download papers. With the systems becoming so much more electronic, we don't have to go and trouble fiscals offices to get hard copy papers in most cases, although sometimes that's necessary. So having that level of expertise, and what I think the inspectorate allows them, allows the seconded people in, is to acquire different skill sets that they don't maybe experience doing day-to-day prosecution work, and take that back and hopefully enhance their own development in COPFS, but also help enhance their work in COPFS when they go back. So, depending on the subject matter, it can be. It's not necessary that it needs to be person seconded, but I need a period of continuity for people to come in. So it is.
You'll maybe understand my concern that you started off by saying, you know, you don't have to have that background, or they don't have to be seconded from COPFS. Yet your whole answer then said how good it was that they are seconded from COPFS. So I'm now sat here wondering, well, when their period is finished, are they just going to be replaced by other people from COPFS? And you've spoken about the benefits. What are the risks? They are investigating and scrutinising a body which they will return to work in. And surely that can be seen as a risk.
Well, as I've pointed out, the findings and recommendations are solely attributable to myself, and I'm independent of any
Sorry,
person.
you're an extremely small team. You're yourself on a 4 days a week. You've got an assistant, and then you've got 3 investigators, 1 part-time, so that only 2 full-time investigators are from the COPFS. So while your name may be printed at the bottom of the report, it wouldn't take a genius to work out where the findings have come from in terms of the investigations. Well, in a team that size.
Yes, obviously in a team that size we all have to play a critical part. But at the end of the day, when I make recommendations and findings, if there's any issue to be taken with them, then it's with myself that that I would have the discussion with COPFS or the Lord Advocate. If there is a possibility to recruit associate inspectors on maybe on a temporary basis, depending, as I've already indicated, if the subject matter lends itself to it. And it may be, for example, in some more specialist areas such as economic crime, I would have to recruit a more specialist financial a specialist into help us with an inspection like that, or if it was IT, maybe some kind of IT expertise. So since I've taken up the post, I have tried to look at different models of staffing the inspectorate, which is why I had recruited the 2 associate inspections. But it does take a bit of time for people to come in and get up to speed on how to do with inspection work and how to do it. So if I had kept turning over staff, it leads to some inefficiencies. So I'm trying to get the balance right that suits a small inspectorate. And we've come up across a model of we've seconded the current 2 inspectors for a 2-year period. And once that finishes, then depending what our future programme is, it's possible that I may look for other avenues, such as maybe through the Scottish Government or other avenues that we would want to recruit to the inspectors. I'm aware HMICS does have a more varied background, but they've got a bigger team. So it's not... It has been the pattern of how it's happened, but it's not fixed in stone. And as I say, I've already tried different models, and we will explore other possible models. And
can I?
Sorry, beg your pardon.
No, if you wanted to finish. No. To continue the discussion you had with Mary Evans and Stuart Stevenson about the Lord Advocate's involvement, not so much in terms of directing inquiries, because I think you've covered that, but he is presented with all reports in draft form. So that's the submission. Is that not correct?
No, the annual report is presented in a draft form to Lord Advocate.
Right, sorry. So he gets your annual report and he sits down and reads your draft report, and he doesn't like something in there, and he says to you, would you mind taking that out? Are you in a difficult position to change something in your draft annual report that then gets laid before Parliament because he's also, or that office is also your employer?
Firstly, that's never happened in the 3 annual reports I've done. But
I think it's useful to tease that out.
Yeah, no, the annual report is really a factual summary of the work that's been done, and it's pretty it's not particularly controversial.
Maybe that's why, though. Potentially.
Well, it's more factual. In terms of the substantive reports we do, at the conclusion of that report, and as I say, we try and share emerging findings along with the key players when we're doing the reports. The report is given to Crown Office and for any comments on factual accuracy, and only factual accuracy, so that I will give them a period of time to read through the report, and they will advise me if they think there's any issues of factual accuracy, and then if there are, then I would obviously...
Can you understand whether there would be a potential perception or a misconception that there is not enough of a division between your office and the Lord Advocate's office? He appoints you, he agrees to reappoint you, he agrees your terms, and finally you present a draft report to him for him to then present to ministers, to members of Parliament, and he's allowed to comment upon that, and it may never have happened before. But the fact that you said it was a fairly generic, factually based document would suggest that it could go into greater detail, greater depth, if maybe there was a further division between your office and the Lord Advocate's office.
Well, I think the more substantive reports where we've done an inspection are the ones that obviously have the criticisms of COPs, and the ones where we've identified risks, and the ones we've identified where there is a need for a service improvement.
So the annual report that comes to MSPs, to ministers, contains no criticisms of the Crown Office and Procurator Fiscal Service?
It contains a summary and a link to the reports, which actually do have a more hard-hitting purpose in the sense of they're actually the reports that actually hopefully will make a difference. The annual report is a summary of the reports we've done. It's to inform the public and MSPs of the reports, but it contains links to the reports and the work we've done in the year, which I think is the important part of the reports. It also allows me an opportunity to explain what direction the inspector is going in, and it provides factual information about the role of the inspectorate. Again, I can only speak from my experience, and in terms of any suggestion of influencing or making any changes to any of my recommendations or findings, it's never happened.
And I would say, you know, my questions are not to the current office holders or anything, but it is just saying, and it's not just me asking this question, it was put in as one of the submissions to this inquiry from the Law Society of Scotland, raised a similar concern. If I can ask a final question on one of the examples you gave on page 5, paragraphs 18 and 19 of your submission. And I've got to say, it was quite disappointing, and I was wondering, first of all, how long this process took. But you're looking at an issue that politicians have raised, people within communities have raised about mental health in prisoners, and you thought this would be a good idea, let's look into this with HMICS, and then at the end of all that, you decided there were so many difficulties in identifying a cohort of prisoners. And I find that disappointing that that's been kind of pushed aside now, or there's certainly significant delays, that's what you're saying. And I just wonder how long that process took, and really why should these difficulties be faced by you as someone and an office trying to improve the court system, the justice system? It was quite troubling to read that.
Okay. The scoping period that we worked with HMICS, I think, was probably about 2 to 3 months. We met with substantial numbers of organisations, and we looked at this because we were aware that this was a priority for many people in the Parliament, and it was raised by the Justice Board with ourselves and HMICS to see if we could undertake some kind of inspection. And we, in particular, I was really keen to actually be able to proceed and undertake an inspection in this area for obvious reasons and for a number of reasons. However, and we obviously wanted to do it for the police because it is a criminal justice issue. This it's not just about the prosecution service and what alternatives they can offer. It was about what happens before you even come into the system and what options are available to the police. And we discovered there is a myriad of different pilots, innovations, and in terms of the fiscals, we did a short but relatively comprehensive study into diversion schemes that were available, and we looked at the possible diversion. And what we found in terms of that, and sorry, I'm slightly going off subject here, was that there wasn't a level playing field, and there was a need for a more consistent approach to having having diversion schemes available throughout Scotland, rather than it was patchy, rather than coherent. But the real difficulty came and this is really because in Scotland, the criminal justice system tends to be crime-centric. The information provided in police reports is about the type of crime. So we can identify knife crime, we can identify domestic abuse crime, but there is less information about the offender. It's not offender-centric. So when we started, and I can provide the committee actually, what we did in the end of the process was we produced a strategic paper to help inform the Justice Board of the gaps and the issues that we had identified, and we quite happily will go back and look at this if these gaps can be rectified, so that we can actually identify a cohort that we can actually see what works, what doesn't work, where the advantages are.
I think just briefly, what I'd like to know is, you say at the end of paragraph 19 that you will revisit this as part of the IPS future work programme, which would suggest you've overcome some of the problems. Were the problems because you tried to do the work alongside HMICS, or why was it that you weren't able to do that joint investigation which you started off wanting to do? And will your ultimate investigation be poorer for the fact that you couldn't go away in your original process that you wanted to do?
The gaps were not within our gift. The work has been progressed. The work that we identified has now been progressed by Police Scotland. Where they are now working with other persons in Scottish Government and Justice Board to take forward some of the areas that we identified in our strategic plan. The information is simply not recorded in a systematic fashion about people who have mental health issues, and the databases that presently exist in Police Scotland were not sophisticated enough to allow us to actually identify persons. It's an issue that I know the Justice Board have been talking about, and they are trying to look at more offender-centric methods of recording crime, and that was what we flagged up, and we were very disappointed that we couldn't. We tried, I've got a paper that I can let you see all the different options we tried to find something that would give us that, to give us a robust sample. Now, we have promised and we have said that this is something, and that in all of the Criminal Justice Board are keen for us to go back and do this with or without HMSCS, but obviously it makes more sense to do it. Once those problems have been overcome, we'll look at it. So I can provide the committee with some background information on the different areas we looked at, and we were just not able to get enough information, data, that would allow us to do something that would add value. And at the end of the day, we want to make findings that actually are realisable and actually evidence-based, and that was my problem. There wasn't enough to allow us to have it evidence-based.
Okay, thank you. I think, Liam, do you have a supplementary you indicated before, Stuart, or was it a substantive?
It was a supplementary on this. I mean, I have another question as well, which I'm happy to come back to.
I'll bring you on this supplementary, Stuart, and then...
I just wanted briefly to nail down the issue of where you draw your staff from. And I just draw on some personal experience in a phrase that was written in my annual appraisal in 1971, which said, Mr. Stevenson is excellent at solving problems, especially when he creates them. And I just wonder if that is exactly capturing why it's right that we have people from the Fiscal Service as part of the Inspectorate, because they will best understand where the bodies lie.
There is certainly an element of truth in that. You need to know the questions sometimes to ask. If you don't know something, then obviously it makes it difficult to have a really in-depth examination. I
think that's it.
And the answers were a little more brief. That would be good, without curtailing anything.
Sorry.
Okay, happy with that, Liam?
Into commenting on Stuart Stevens' past employment appraisals, but just keep into... I'm sure there is, Stuart. I think that under the 2007 Act, the inspector is appointed by the Lord Advocate. We've already touched on the extent to which the Lord Advocate can invite the inspector to look at particular issues. We've discussed the extent to which there is that very close relationship with COPFS and in terms of where you derive your staffing from, and also a lack of awareness. I mean, does this not simply reinforce the point made by the Law Society of Scotland that what we need is more individuals involved in the inspectorate who aren't PFs or employees of COPs? That there are clearly issues in COPs at the moment, and we'll come on to the substantive issues in a moment. But at the moment, whether it's those representing sheriffs, whether it's the Law Society of Scotland, whether it's victims groups, none are seeing the inspectorate as the route through which addressing those issues is best secured.
I should probably have mentioned that the position of Chief Inspector is is advertised nationally and is open to anybody that's got the relevant qualifications and skills. You don't have to be a prosecutor to apply to be the Chief Inspector, and it's an open, transparent process involving assessment centre and interview panel. And following all of that process, the recommendation is then made to the Lord Advocate.
But in that process now, I mean, given what we've heard about the issues in relation to transparency and some of the concerns around independence, and I take the point about those who will know where the bodies are buried, are those with a direct experience. But we've heard quite a lot of evidence over recent weeks about others who have an understanding of how COPs work, have very clear views about how it can be made to work better, but wouldn't necessarily suffer from the same perception or misconception that they have a dog in the race, that they owe some allegiance, whatever, to COPs, that would help in addressing this point about independence, but also may raise the awareness of what the Inspectorate does amongst the wider stakeholders that we've been hearing from on a weekly basis in relation to the inquiry that we're doing.
Well, as I said, it is open to anybody from to apply, and if they meet the relevant qualifications. And I went through a process and was appointed, but I'm sure there was other people in that process that didn't maybe come from a prosecutorial background. But so that's a matter that's undertaken by the Scottish Government, and then, as I say, a recommendation is made. In terms of obviously, I've alluded to some of the benefits of being a prosecutor, because you do know the right questions to ask, you do know the issues that are causing difficulty, and you do have an understanding of when somebody says the High Court business is 70%, what actually that feels like in real terms, and how it can be managed. But yes, we will, in terms of, and I take the point about the awareness of the Inspectorate. Again, I would say we are quite a small, compact inspectorate, and we don't produce as many reports as some of the other inspectorates because of that. But we will engage, we do engage with stakeholders in relative to the subject matter, and as a result, and the sexual offences is probably one of the biggest reviews we're going to do for some time, and there is obviously a number of people who have contributed to this inquiry that we will be engaging with, and we are very aware of some of the issues that have been raised in this inquiry from our other reports. So we have the benefit of taking, for example, the issues that arose through the complaints handling about a lack of customer focus, which has been mentioned in terms of the submissions. In terms of victim representation, in terms of disclosure of sensitive personal records, that will be a feature of an aspect we will look at, and again we will liaise with various stakeholders that gave evidence to the committee on that. So maybe because this is a wider ranging subject, and it has a lot of different facets to it that we are going to be looking at, then that will hopefully go some way to heighten our awareness. But I think it's about having the experience sometimes and the knowledge that can actually get under the surface of some of these, but I'm not saying it
it's
can
an
be done by
experience and a knowledge
other,
of how it works, and I understand there's a value to that, but it doesn't necessarily give confidence. There's a challenge function there about how things can be made to work better, or an entirely different approach adopted to deliver the objectives. And I think that's the concern, that in a sense you understand how the mechanics ought to operate because of your intimate experience of it, but you don't necessarily have an investment in making it work differently and better.
Well, there's no reason why, as well as Ms MacLeod answering, Ms Lewington can also, if you want to prefer your view as the Assistant Inspector.
Well, if I could just briefly go back to the organ retention report. At the time that we were looking at that issue, and obviously there was significant public concern about it, the overwhelming discussions with people was to have almost an overly bureaucratic system put in place, because people were nervous about it and they felt that that was the best way. By the fact that we went out and had an objective overview of what had happened, and we spoke to pathologists and realised that that actually there was no need to take organs, but this hadn't been necessarily highlighted within the fiscal service and with the appropriate bodies. So we actually turned that all on its head, and our system, the system that was advocated in the report, was, because it's now exceptional, we will streamline that system, and we will have the system, a reconciliation, mandatory reconciliation between the service providers and COPFS that actually addresses that particular problem. And we will not throw paper and bureaucracy. We will look at the simplest way possible to do it. And I think that it did, you know, a prosecution background didn't really apply in coming up with that decision, and I think was best way forward in terms of the report. And the report was accepted in its entirety, despite it being not what was anticipated or envisaged in the first instance. And of another example, perhaps, is sorry. Yes,
because I'm conscious of time. Is the short answer to what Liam is saying that you will look at maybe widening the membership beyond the prosecution sector? And it certainly seems to us that some of the best evidence we've had is from defence solicitors, so I think that's encouraging. I'm very conscious that you haven't said anything yet, Ms. Lillington. Would you like to add something?
Well, I mean, I'm relatively new to the inspectorate. I've only been in post for about 6 months. Right. And that's against the background of being a fiscal or a depute for some 22 years. But I can say just from my own personal experience, if it assists the committee at all, that you do feel quite a difference when you do move into that different role. It does give you that step back and that objectivity. It naturally comes, I have to say. Although the inspectorate would have maybe some of the same goals as COPFS, we all want to improve that service for the public. And obviously for staff as well, some of those issues that have risen in relation to staff issues. There are different functions there, and there is a separation there, and that separation is certainly clear to me in my experience so far.
Thank you. Liam? Thank you. And Ben, then followed by Rona.
The points that I looked to raise, Convener, were covered in the answer to Douglas Ross around paragraphs 18 and 19, and I would also be interested to see the background documentation around that, so look forward to reading that. Thank you.
Yeah, Rona?
Yes, I would like to know if any concerns have been raised with you, Chief Inspector, regarding the way domestic abuse cases are handled by the Crown Office and Procurator Fiscal Service, and do you agree that there appears to be there is a culture of zero tolerance, and that there is some pressure to prosecute in these cases, perhaps, you know, with maybe a lack of evidence?
Domestic abuse is an area that we have considered as a possible area for inspection. However, we are aware that currently it is being monitored by a number of different parties, and the Auditor General spoke about Audit Scotland's role in looking at the performance in terms of value for money in cases proceeding through court. In policy terms, I didn't hear all of the Lord Advocate's evidence this morning, but I'm aware that the Lord Advocate is has a robust policy in relation to domestic abuse, and if there's sufficient evidence, there's a presumption of proceedings. And it's not for me to stray into policy areas. All I would say in that regard is that prosecution policy is a legitimate tool to try and change behaviours, and we've seen that work in the past with knife crime, drink driving and hate crime. Given the policy and given that the recent statistics as given evidence to this committee by ACC Higgins, is that 80% of the cases that they report to the fiscal result in a conviction, which would suggest that the decision making is pretty spot on in terms of that high percentage. Given the number of people monitoring this area, we felt there was probably less value that we could add at this stage to look at domestic abuse than perhaps looking at the investigation prosecution of sexual offences, where there's a number more issues that we'd like to explore. So it is something we've had on our radar. We are conscious of all the discussion, and we have been listening to the submissions to the committee. Finally, I would just say that I don't know if the Lord Advocate mentioned it today, but there is a prosecution code that prosecutors work to, and nobody should be taking cases. There should be no cases taken without sufficient evidence, and I think that was borne out in some of the evidence that the Lord Advocate gave. And the Lord Advocate has indicated that he is keen to place trust and faith in prosecutors.
Thanks. Are you happy with the independent review panel's position on all of this?
The independent review panels is something that is relatively new to COPFS, and as part of having our discussions with Crown Office, we looked to see where they're adding value and continuous improvement, and we were quite impressed at the concept of the review panel in terms of improving opency and transparency of decision making. I personally haven't sat in a review panel and I haven't seen the paperwork of it, but it is something that we'll probably look at seeing the benefit of when we go to look at our sexual offences review, and maybe have more of an opportunity to see how it actually works in practice.
Okay, thank you.
Mary?
Thank you, Convener. And my question follows on quite nicely from my colleague's question. Your paper points out the review that you've recently embarked on in the investigation and prosecution of sexual crimes.
Yes.
And there is more and more use of specialist areas within the Crown Office service. And I've got two small questions to ask you. And one is, do you intend looking at any of the other specialisms? And do you have any concerns that the increasing use of specialist courts and specialist services dilutes from the core function of the Crown Office?
There have been specialists in sexual offences probably since the setting up of the National Sexual Crimes Unit in, I think, 2009. So it was one of the first areas to attract a specialist criteria, and all the deputies that required to be involved in sexual offences have required accreditation, special training, etc. As part of our review, the committee will be aware that the Crown Office has recently restructured yet again, and we're looking so we're looking at the High Court sexual offences. And so we're going to incorporate, as part of that review, a look at how the functional hubs are working under the new structure. So we'll look at the governance arrangements that have come in with the new structure, and the new teams that are going to take forward dealing with these offences. So we will look at a bit wider at the specialist role and how they're adding value to the cases at each stage of the proceedings. I think I caught the end of the evidence from the Crown Agent and the Lord Advocate, and clearly in certain particular cases having a specialist who understands the dynamics of the different aspects of domestic abuse, sexual offending, is extremely important, and it has been. The NSCU is actually an area that we'll have a look at as part of the review to see, again, how they fit into the wider scheme of looking at the specialisms. In terms of the general fiscal service, I have no input into the budget allocation or the prioritisation by COPS. All I can do is, when I look at a particular area, identify where I see a training need, or identify where there's a staffing need, or identify where there's some other measure that needs to be put in place. For example, in the FEIs, we came across frustration on behalf of many nearest relatives that there was no continuity of a single person taking them through from that beginning and the end process, and we made that recommendation, which has been accepted, but we acknowledge that has resourcing implications for COPS. So we make comments on individual areas about resourcing. I have no input into the actual prioritisation of overall budgetary control. That's just more for Audit Scotland to look at the financial sustainability.
What's the timescale for the review that you've just recently started?
Well, as I say, we are presently just about to conclude the scoping of that, which will allow us to plan the timescales. I think we probably need, we were at the moment looking at what sample size we would maybe want to do a case review. Once we've decided that, that will inform how long it will take, but I can certainly provide information on timescales to the committee once we come to that conclusion.
I wonder if, Chief Inspector, you could offer a view as to why senior managers had become invisible. I'm referring to your annual report.
Yes, the annual report highlighted some concerns that had come out of the consultation exercise that occurred in the Shaping the Future programme that was initiated by COPS. And I think I highlighted some of the concerns that were flagged up by staff in COPFS, one of them being lack of visibility by managers, and the other one was about resilience because of the ring fencing of sheriff and jury business, and summary meant there was less flexibility and resilience when there was particular staff shortages for a particular reason. Those were consequences of the move to the federation structure, which was started in 2012. I think they were acknowledged at the end of that consultation exercise by senior management COPFS as resulting from really unintended consequences of the federation process, and they're looking in the new model. Obviously, the Crown Office have moved to a functional model to deal with core work, and as part of that, they've reintroduced local court, which now combines again sheriff and jury and summary business. So hopefully, it's still very early days and it's still to bed in, and it is something that obviously we do keep a watching brief in all of these areas of COPFS, but hopefully this will now allow for more resilience back in the sheriff courts. And in terms of the visibility of fiscals, there's now, because they're aligned with the local sheriffdoms, the 6 sheriffdoms, there's a procurator fiscal for each sheriffdom. It's kind of reinforced, reinstituted the link between courts, police and local fiscal that perhaps for the summary level had been spread too thin because the federation structure was really big, large structures, east, north, west, etc. So I think they've taken on board the criticism and the comments and the feedback, and hopefully this new structure is seen as a way of addressing that. And I heard the Crown Agent allude to fair futures and some of the other issues that came out of that consultation, such as well-being issues that really impact on staff, quality of life, etc. They are going to be taken forward under the Fair Futures programme, and that's something again that we are very keen to keep an eye on, and I've had discussions with the Director of HR as to what work streams are involved in that, and we will maybe look at in due course how that was developed, what outcomes were identified and how they were implemented. So there may be scope for us to do something in due course, and we're definitely watching how that progresses in due course.
I suppose the question that's something I asked the Auditor General as well, given all that's come out of this inquiry, and there has been a lot, has it changed how you would maybe approach your inspections? It's been very much on a thematic approach, or maybe not in your tenure, certainly before, as opposed to a holistic approach. Is there anything that you would change in how you've approached the inspections?
I think one of the issues since I took up post is it's been as I say in my annual reports, it's never stopped changing. The structures have changed from 2012 and then they've moved on. So it's been hard to sometimes just to make a recommendation with things that keep moving forward. But I would say, and I alluded to it, that in terms of the sexual offences, now that we have got the functional teams in place, this will give us an opportunity to look at more about the structure around that, as well as actually the thematic of sexual offences. So we will hopefully look at the new structure regime that's been put in place, as well as the thematic subject matter of sexual offences. But
can I ask you what you think the biggest challenge is for the Crown and Procurator Fiscal Service?
Well, given one of the factors that we've decided to look at sexual offences was because we identified that with increasing volume of serious crime, now 70% sexual, global crime transcending national boundaries, all becoming much more complex in terms of the management of High Court cases, we said in the Management of Time Limits report that there was a risk of these cases being lost because of budget, in times of budgetary constraint. That pre-petition work has continued to increase, and it was 50% when we were looking at it in the Management of Time Limits as the average of the High Court. It's now 70%. So we have picked this area because we think this is a significant risk area. We think it's high profile, and we hope that we can identify areas where we can
so
make
it'll be
improvements.
analysing and looking behind that, which I think that sounds like an excellent way forward, and hopefully when you complete that work, everyone will know.
I hope so.
Who the Inspector of Prosecution is. That completes our questioning. Just before we can I ask Ms Lewington, will you be returning to the service once you've completed your secondment?
It is just a 2-year secondment, so yes, that's my plan.
Okay, thank you both very much for appearing before us today. Can we just move on rather than suspend? I don't want any more suspensions. If we could suspend briefly just to let the witnesses go, but I don't want you to move anywhere because we'll move swiftly on. Agenda item 4 is subordinate legislation and consideration of negative SSI, line court and office fees variation devolved functions order 2016 SSI 2016/390. I refer members to paper 5. Do members have any comments? John Finney.
Thank you, Convener. I think many people find it strange that we're still talking about these sort of things and an individual can't just have a coat of arms if they want. But what I wanted to comment on was paragraph 9 of the paper, which used a term which I don't know that I understand and I don't know that it's helpful, and that is the term a joint informal consultation took place. I think we want formality if we're dealing with legislation that has expenditure implications.
I'll ask the clerk their advice on this because Peter has seen it before.
Sorry, I've little to add to what the member said, just to say that I have seen that wording used before in these types of consultations on instruments. But
do you want to make a recommendation that it shouldn't be used or that there's other wording?
Well, it just seems entirely out of kilter with a subsequent paragraph that then lists a group of people who have been consulted and a number of representatives. So I don't know how informal it is. Is this someone picking up a phone? Presumably there's a list somewhere. Let's just keep things formal if it's legislation. Okay. That's all.
Right, noted. Stuart Stevenson.
Just on that point, just for information, I note that the income the Lord Line Court receives from its efforts amount to £60,000 a year. In other words, we're not talking a very large amount of money, and I do happen to know that the application for a coat of arms is of the order of £3,000. So we're probably talking about a very small number of people. Maybe, I don't express the view that's certainty, maybe that's why an informal. I only suggest.
Yeah, for the avoidance of doubt, my comment about that is about the fact that we have a piece of legislation here and that term's been used. It's not what the actual bit of legislation is. I think we should have formality about legislation in this.
Okay. That's noted, but are you content not to make any recommendations? Yes. All agreed? Thank you for that. Agenda item 5, Justice Subcommittee on Policing. This is to consider a report back from the last meeting of the Justice Subcommittee on Policing on 15th of December when it discussed a draft letter to the Cabinet Secretary on financial planning for 2017-18 in relation to the police budget. I will invite Mary Fee, the subcommittee convener, to report back. Before I do, can I advise members that following the verbal report there will be an opportunity for brief comments or questions. If there are any specific areas of work members wish the Justice Committee to consider in more detail, this can be discussed under the programme item, which is at this meeting or at a future meeting. I refer members to paper 6, and Mary, would you give your verbal report, please?
Thank you, Convener. The Justice Subcommittee on Policing met on the 15th of December 2016 and agreed the content of our letter to the Justice Committee on Police Scotland and the SPA's financial planning for 2017-18. A copy has been included in today's meeting papers, and as you can see from the letter, we reached conclusions in relation to the following issues: the forecast overspend of £17.5 million for 2016-17, communicating effectively with staff about financial plans, achieving efficiency savings, tackling new and emerging crimes, undertaking non-criminal work such as assisting those with health issues, and VAT liability. I hope the letter speaks for itself, but I am happy to address any questions or comments you may have. And the committee has previously agreed that the letter would be included as an annex to its report to the Finance Committee about the 2017-18 draft budget. Thank you.
Members have any questions? Douglas Roth.
I thought this was very useful after the discussion we had last week about having more information, and it's a very good summary. My question is just, convener, whichever convener, we have a minute of the meeting added to our desk today, which includes reference to a vote that took place. Can I ask, for those of us not at the subcommittee, was the division Margaret Mitchell asking for an amendment to be included and 6 members wanting that amendment not to be included? Did the members vote against it because that wasn't said? Or why did they vote against it?
That was the meeting last week was held in private.
So anything that happened in private, the note is...
Is this private?
No, that's tabled and it will be on the website, and it's an explanation of what came out of that meeting. But any discussions that took place were in private, so they wouldn't be anything that would be legitimate questioning for Mary at this point.
What can we do with this minute then?
Well, the minute is a matter of record, and that stands. What we're looking at now is there any issues, and I suspect there will be from the letter and the areas that the committee looked in the subcommittee, which we might indicate that we want to include for discussion later in our work programme. Stuart Stevenson and then Douglas.
I was just going to make the general point that I think absolutely it should feed into the work programme of the main committee, and indeed the main committee should perhaps give consideration as to whether it wishes to draw the subcommittee's attention to matters it would wish the subcommittee to address, because it is a subcommittee of the main committee.
I remind members, we formed this so that the whole Justice Committee could be informed and have a view on policing issues, which are very important. Mary, sorry.
Say that the subcommittee is meeting on the 12th of January, and that's when we're looking at our work programme. So, you know, if any members have any issues I think we should be looking at in relation to the work we're going to do, I'd be happy to be told about that.
Okay, Douglas?
Well, I think one of the issues I wanted us as a committee, but if you're not setting your work programme until the 12th of January, do we have to wait to see what you're looking further into? Because I think the I6 issue, there's still some dubiety in this report. You know, the Cabinet Secretary said that the savings of I6 and IT weren't included in the large savings Police Scotland have to make, yet the Association of Superintendents said there was issues there. And I wonder, can we look at that as a full Justice Committee, or is that something you plan to look at? As
anything that's in the letter we can consider under our work programme.
Well, that would be something I think we should look at, because it seemed from this letter from the subcommittee that there were differing opinions as to the savings, where the savings are allocated in terms of any IT savings, and how much has been saved or spent in public money, etc.
Okay, that's noted. Are we content with that approach to John Finney?
Yeah, no, I don't know that there is the uncertainty that Douglas suggests about that issue, but I think it's very important that it is seen as being inclusive, and that there are no, if we would have it, no members of this committee would feel in any way disenfranchised, but equally we need to avoid duplication. Is what we need to avoid. But if we're making bids, and just since that will be on the record, whereas the work programme will not be on unfortunately not be on the record, then with almost daily revelations about the impact of surveillance and undercover policing, further ones yesterday, I would be very concerned if there wasn't attention paid to that by whichever committee, either the substantive committee or the subcommittee. There's widespread public concern about this, and the frustration that's gone into people who are legitimately pursuing issues of being deceived.
Duly noted. Any other questions? If not, then we shall move into private session. Before I do so, wish everyone formally a Merry Christmas and relaxing festive period. I suspend the meeting now to allow the public and the official report to leave the room.